Klaeysen. And many of you may recall, some of you perhaps not, that Anne was a leader of our ethical society from 2002 to 2008 and has since moved on, and she serves as the Director of Family Programs for the New York Society for Ethical Culture. She also has a number of other positions that are related to her chaplaincy. She is a chaplain at NYU and a chaplain at Columbia. As well, when she was with us here in Long Island, she was the first chaplain at Adelphi University, humanist chaplain. All of these relate to her humanism. And is a graduate of the Humanist Institute. She also co-mentored Class 15 and is now co-dean of the Institute as well. She holds a Doctor of Ministry degree in pastoral care from Union College, and Anne will be speaking with us about a most timely and surely a very controversial issue related to race relations. So Anne, up to you.
Good morning. Get this down here so I can. Okay, nice to see all of you. Well, the topic is white privilege, a wake-up call. And it came about because, February comes around. And in February, which is Black History Month, we all think that we need to do a platform on Black history. And so I thought, well, let's not make this the usual. Let's not be pro forma about this. After all, what does a middle-aged white woman have to say about the Black experience? Well, what I can say is that as a white woman, I experience white privilege. It is something that Peggy McIntosh refers to as an invisible and weightless knapsack that I wear, that holds in it all the privileges, all the values, all the extra things that allow me to walk in the world in a very different way from people of color. So I'm going to show you, I'm going to bookend this morning's talk with videos. And this first one is from a woman, and her name is Joy DeGuerre, and it's called A Trip to the Grocery Store. So let's see if we can get this going. Turn down the lights to waiting. Okay, this was on before. Excuse me. We had it all set up, so I thought this was going to... Okay.
It should be right when you're
Okay, should be right.
5 minutes ago.
Okay.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white. Blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day, and Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me, and she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? It's been a nice day today. They're just chatting up. And says, yeah, so Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming from her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women. All right, I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you got to choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book. All right, so this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over, and she steps in and she says, "Excuse me, why are you doing this?" And the checker goes, "Well, what do you mean?" She goes, "Why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that?" She goes, "Well, this is our policy." She goes, "No, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me." "Oh, well, I know you've been." She goes, No, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It's totally unacceptable. At which point, the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, "Is there a problem here?" And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, "Yes, there is a problem here. Here's what happened." So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, "This is unfair. Why are you doing this to me?" Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used her white privilege to educate and make right a situation that was wrong. That's what you can do every single day.
Is that familiar to any of you?
Oh, yes.
Have you experienced that? Have you seen that happen? Right? That's white privilege. And we walk in the world in a very, very different way. I highly recommend showing the entire documentary. It's called Cracking the Codes, the System of Racial Inequity. And after I gave this platform address at the New York Society, we scheduled 2 showings of it, one in the afternoon and one in the evening, to be able to accommodate different people's schedules. And it makes a difference. It makes a difference when you realize that you walk in the world in a different way. And what too often happens is that white people become very defensive, right? Well, I'm not racist. I haven't done anything. I didn't do anything. Why are you angry at me? Well, that's not the point. The point is, just by the way that we look, we have privileges. Well, where does this whole notion come from? Let's go back a little bit and look at a history and a definition of white privilege. W.E.B. Du Bois, who spoke at the New York Society for Ethical Culture on a number of occasions. And in 1935, he wrote a book called Black Reconstruction in America. And there he introduced the concept of a psychological wage for white laborers. This special status, he argued, divided the labor movement by leading low-wage white workers to feel superior to low-wage black workers. And he wrote, "It must be remembered that the white group of laborers, while they receive a low wage, were compensated in part by a sort of public and psychological wage. They were given public deference and titles of courtesy because they were white. They were admitted freely with all classes of white people to public functions, public parks, and the best schools. The police were drawn from their ranks, and the courts, dependent on their votes, treated them with leniency as to encourage lawlessness. Their vote selected public officials. And while this had small effect upon the economic situation, it had great effect upon their personal treatment and the deference shown them. White schoolhouses were the best in the community, and conspicuously placed, and they cost anywhere from twice to 10 times as much per capita as the colored schools. The newspapers specialized on news that flattered the poor whites and almost entirely ignored the Negro, except in crime and ridicule. So that's 1935, really lifting that up, drawing attention to that. That here you have a class of laborers making the same wage, and yet some have a distinct difference and experience a distinct preference in the world. Well, here's some contemporary definitions. White privilege has been defined by David Wellman as a system of advantage based on race, and it's been compared by Peggy McIntosh, and I've mentioned this earlier, to an invisible, weightless knapsack of assets and resources that she was given because she was born white in her time and her place in U.S. society. Paula Rothenberg defines white privilege as the other side of discrimination, meaning the opposite of discrimination. It is a form of racism that both underlies and is distinct from institutional and overt racism. It underlies them in a way that are both predicated on preserving the privileges of white people, regardless of whether the agents recognize this or not. That's important. The agents we can be unaware of it. That's why it's so important to become aware of it. It also has a distinct term in terms of intentionality. It refers to different structures, practices, ideologies. In other words, we have learned our lesson well, right? We have learned well not to notice that we have privilege. We believe that our experience in the world is normal and that other people's experience is entirely dependent upon them as individuals, right? But it's not. Because we are part of a structure, we're part of a politics, and as Peggy McIntosh says, and I refer to her a lot, and I highly recommend looking up her work and about the invisible knapsack. She was one of the leaders in the women's studies. And so she was out there in the 80s talking about discrimination, talking about gender differences. And one day, she said, while she was a women's studies scholar at Wellesley, she wrote a paper on white privilege and male privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through the work in women's studies. So she said, well, if I'm experiencing discrimination because I'm a woman, and I know that I am, and other women know that we are, and we're raising this up, and we're confronting men with this. Well, can't I use, and shouldn't I indeed use, the same tools that I apply to women's studies and apply them to white privilege? And when she did this, she came up with a list of several things that she experienced every day that identified her. For example, one of them was, I never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. That was one of the things she mentioned. And yet, how many people of color feel that they are speaking on behalf of an entire race? Remember Joy talking about her experience in the grocery store. Right? She sees the two elderly white women behind her. And so she thinks, well, if I say something, I'm going to be seen as the stereotype, the angry black woman. All of this is going through her mind while she's at a grocery store with her 10-year-old daughter in full-blown emotional upset because she sees the difference. So here's Joy trying to take in all of this stuff that's going on inside her to decide how to handle the situation. It is exhausting. How many of us who are white are exhausted? I'm not exhausted trying to defend either my gender or my color. So this is another overlay that we need to be aware of. Another thing she said was, in her list of things, I can be pretty sure that if I asked to speak to the person in charge, I will be facing a person of my race. Now, this was back in 1988, and certainly things have changed. But the immediate response that she got to this paper was from a number of different areas, as you might imagine. One was from conservatives who said, well, that's just ridiculous. That's just silly. And she said, well, they've been saying that to me about my gender studies, so, what the heck? I'm crazy. Other people were saying to her, people of color were saying, thank you for articulating it, because we knew that something was at play. We knew that something was going on. We weren't being faced with overt racism, but there was something there. Thank you for helping me to understand that I'm not crazy, that it really is going on. And then a number of women, particularly white women, joined her workshops because they wanted to be more aware. And what happened with them often is that they would just fall apart crying and saying, I didn't know, I'm so sorry. And she said, it's okay. You learned your lesson well. You grew up in a family, in a culture, in a school, in a society that reinforced all of this and told you that you were normal and it was okay. You're learning a new lesson now. You're learning a new history now. Learn this one just as well. And I think that's the kind of approach that we need to take, because so often we hear this, as I said, that kind of defensiveness about it, that kind of, well, I didn't mean it wasn't my intention. And we need to learn that even though we don't have that intention, there are consequences of our behavior, and we need to listen very closely and hear what people are telling us. In this documentary, from which I just showed you a segment, there's a piece where they show a black and white woman in an interaction, and they're actors, so they're showing what goes on. And the white woman is saying, well, that just can't be the case because it's not what I meant. And the black woman is saying, that may not be what you meant. Here is how I experienced it. Please hear me. This is how I experience it. So we need to let go of some of that defensiveness that we have, the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, that we're good people. You're still good people, but you're learning a new lesson. You're learning something new. Privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of the groups they belong to, rather than because of anything they've done or failed to do. Access to privilege doesn't determine one's outcomes, but it is definitely an asset that makes it more likely that whatever talent, ability, and aspirations a person with privilege has will result in something positive for them. We kind of play into this, don't we, that we're all responsible. And certainly as humanists, we do, right? As a humanist, I take responsibility for my actions in the world. We need also to be aware that there is a context for that world. And so in that context, I may have a different set of assets than someone else. Well, there are a couple of tests that you can take to find out where you fall on this scale. One of them is called the Implicit Association Test, IAT. And you can find it at www.understandingprejudice.org. Very simple to understand, understandingprejudice.org. And it was established in 2002 with funding from the National Science Foundation, Science Foundation, and McGraw-Hill Higher Education. And the purpose of the site is to offer educational resources and information on prejudice, discrimination, and multiculturalism, and diversity, with the ultimate goal of reducing the level of intolerance and bias in contemporary society. And it's interesting. I highly recommend taking this implicit association test. Don't feel guilty, just take it for your own sake, for your own information. There's another online test you can take, and it's called How Privileged Are You? And you can get this one on BuzzFeed. So just go on BuzzFeed.com and put in the search, How Privileged Are You? The results I got, that I live with 59 out of 100 points of privilege. So it says, you're quite privileged. You've had a few struggles, but overall your life has been far easier than most. This is not a bad thing, nor is it something to be ashamed of. But you should be aware of your advantages and work to help others who don't have them. Thank you for checking your privilege. So I think it was helpful, and I have to say, I tried hard to be downtrodden. And when I answered this, I mean, I really, when there was a doubt, I got screwed over. And even so, I came out as very privileged. Well, I want to give you an example of two seminary students at Union Theological. And you may have seen this. There was an article in the Times by Jim Dwyer. It was called Unequal Treatment of Two Protesters in the Eric Garner Case, one white and one black. So there were two students. And of course, Eric Garner, famous case in New York on Staten Island, the grand jury there, similar to the one in Ferguson, decided that there were no grounds for an indictment of a police officer who killed an unarmed black man. And so in New York City, and I'm sure out here as well, there were many, many protests. And these two friends, Sean and Benjamin, were getting ready to go out with other classmates at Union Theological for a protest. And they knew ahead of time that they were likely to get arrested. Indeed, they wanted to be arrested. And they had arranged with the National Lawyers Guild to represent them. And so here they are, Sean Torres, 23. Benjamin Perry, 24, both graduate students. And they took part in this one night. There were a number of demonstrations, and I was at one in Foley Square, and they continued downtown, and they went uptown, and they closed the Upper West Side, closed the highway. So it was raining. It was a miserable night, but there were many of us in the streets, and many of us were going to different demonstrations. So anyway, they briefly blocked the FDR Drive near Delancey Street, and then they were arrested, as they expected to be. But Mr. Perry, who's white, and Mr. Torrey, who's black, say that what happened afterwards shows a stark contrast. And the president of UTS, Union Theological, wrote to Mayor de Blasio to suggest that their experiences might be something that they could use as an object lesson with NYPD. So they were standing on the road, their arms were linked just after 11 p.m., and they heard the police sergeant's final warning. But they decided that they were going to disobey. We were peacefully offering ourselves up, Mr. Perry said. So two officers grabbed Mr. Torres and cuffed him with the plastic ties. In the process, one of them ended up pushing Ben away. So Ben says, I put my hands behind my head, waiting to be arrested. Another officer grabbed me, threw me face first on the ground, put his head next to my ears and whispered, just get out of here. Mr. Torres, meanwhile, had been deposited in the back of a police van. I was the first one in, he said. So Ben Perry climbs to his feet. He says, I was bewildered. I wasn't going to leave Sean alone. I just stood there and waited. In about 20 seconds, another officer sees him. He cuffs him, but he didn't want to process him. He took him to the other cops. Do you guys want to take him in? Ben had to look for a cop who would arrest him and put him in the van next to his friend Sean, who was the first one who was cuffed, right? I was shopping around. He finally found one, and they went to the police headquarters, where their belts and shoelaces were confiscated, several pins and buttons were removed. The officer told him they were weapons, but the identical pins and buttons that Ben was wearing were not taken off. They were not considered to be weapons on the white kid, but they were considered to be weapons on the black one. Anyway, he was able to prevail upon his arresting officer to contact a hotline at the seminary to handle the protests. Not so for Sean Torres. I asked my arresting officer 3 times to make a call for me, but he would not. 2 students at Union Theological, one white, one black, treated differently. Are you surprised? No, we're not surprised. I think my surprise in this was that it was so blatant, that it was so blatant. Well, here's another story about two guys also, one white, one black. And this fellow named Forte wrote a little piece in his Princeton newsletter, and it was called "Why I'll Never Apologize for My White Male Privilege." And he talked about how there's this phrase that floats around on college campuses about all the different merits and privileges and everything, and the saying goes, check your privilege. So he's been reprimanded several times for this. And he says, I don't accuse those who check me and my perspective of overt racism, although the phrase, which assumes that simply because I belong to a certain ethnic group, I should be judged collectively, I don't buy that. So anyway, so he does this piece in the Princeton paper, and don't you know, Time magazine picks it up, and they post it. And of course it gets a lot of spin and everybody's listening to it. Here's this poor kid, and he writes about his family. They were Holocaust survivors. They came here, they started businesses, and they did so well. And he refers to the whole idea of meritocracy, that his family just pulled themselves up and they did really well for themselves. And he's just not going to apologize for that. I'm just not going to apologize for that. Well, somebody named Dex Digital, I suspect that's not his real name. But Dex Digital posted something in response to that, and it's called, You Don't Have to Apologize for Being White. And so he refers to this. He said, you brought up some of the horrors of the Holocaust. That's a pretty heavy card to play right off the bat, but it's not going to work for me. I forgot to tell you, I'm black. And I bet you can already guess where I'm going with this. You want to tell me about the systematic extermination of 6 million? I see that and raise you to 10 million. You want to talk to me about a few years of forced labor? Let's try a few hundred. You seem to be able to trace your family's history back pretty far. That's awesome. I can't, because they didn't really keep records for property like that back then. It's good that you've put effort into understanding your past, but we also need to understand everyone's present. What I'm trying to get at here is that bringing up various ways that your ancestors' lives sucked isn't a good defense for racism. I'm not saying that you're a racist, open parens, but it's okay if you are, close parens. I'm saying that you are probably unwittingly defending the racism that exists in society. And he also mentions in there, he says, isn't it interesting that Time magazine picks this up and it gets a whole lot of spin? He says, I'm not really blaming you, but he said, I'm a professor, I teach graduate students, and he said, I think I would have given your essay a C. It really wasn't very well written. The grammar was really bad. You'd think that somebody would have done you a favor and edited it before they put it in Time. At any rate, so there are many people who recognize this privilege. Indeed, there's something now called #criming while white. Yes, #criming while white. And this is mostly young white people who have zeroed in on their privilege, and they have posted things that have said, I did this or I did the other thing, and I was never arrested for it. Sort of like, Ben Perry, shopping around for a cop who would arrest him, right? I've done these things. And some of them even include videotapes. I mean, some of them are, their own anecdotes, their own stories, but some of them are videotapes and say, I did these things. And not only was I not stopped, but and some of them, I have to say, some of them are sort of by way of a confessional, that I shouldn't have behaved this way. I shouldn't have. I shouldn't have spoken to the cop the way I did. But I did, and I wasn't arrested. And I know my friends who are of color would never be able to do that, would never be able to get away with that. So, years ago, I took my 3-year-old son up to visit my parents, and we flew into the Rochester airport. And Rochester, as you may know, is a pretty divided city. It's economically, disparities there. The schools in the city are horrible, and of course the suburbs are much better. But when my son got into the airport, he looked around and he said, my honey, where are all the other people? He was so aware as a child growing up in Brooklyn and seeing the people he saw every day, that there was something missing. There was something missing at the Rochester airport, that everyone was lily white. And we didn't spend much time in the city of Rochester. We would drive out to my parents' farm, and all of them were white. His best friend is black. Where are people who look like his best friend? Well, that's the kind of thing that I'd like to see more kids say. Where are all the other people? I need to be with all those other people. Remember that saying from the Xhosa people of South Africa, I am because we are? I am because we are, and we need to be a diverse community. We are also because I am, right? The community needs each individual in it. Well, I'm going to close now with another video. And this is one that's called Get Home Safely, 10 Rules of Survival. And this is something that came out after Michael Brown's death. And it was something that I think we are aware that black children need to be told different lessons than white children. Mayor de Blasio got into big trouble over this because he said he had to teach his son. And Patrick Lynch, who is he still? He hasn't been unseated yet. The head of the union of the NYPD, encouraged people to turn their backs on the mayor for speaking the truth. And so this is an example of it. So I'm hoping I can find it. It should be right here. Can you see? I just need to bring this up.
10 rules. 10 rules.
10 rules.
10 rules of survival.
10 rules of survival if stopped by the police.
Number 1, be polite and respectful when stopped by the police.
Be polite.
Be respectful.
Remember that your goal is to get home safely.
Your goal is to get home safely.
Your goal is to get home safely. I'm sorry.
Number 2, if you feel your rights have been violated, you and your parents have a right to file a formal complaint with your local police jurisdiction.
Number 3, do not, under any circumstances, get in an argument with the police.
Number 4, always remember that anything you say or do can be used against you in court.
Number 5, keep your hands in plain sight.
Make sure the police can see your hands at all times.
Number 6, avoid physical contact with police officers. Do not make any sudden movements and keep your hands out of your pockets.
Number 7,
Do not.
Do not.
Do not. Do not. Do not.
Do not run, even if you are afraid. Number 8, even if you believe you are innocent, do not resist arrest.
Number 9, if you are arrested, do not make any statements about the incident until you are able to meet with a lawyer or public defender.
Number 10, stay calm and remain in control.
Watch your words. Watch your body language.
Watch your emotions. Remember,
Remember, your goal is to get home safely.
Get home safely. Thank you.